thank you for hanging around for the second afternoon, the after lunch slots. I was idly wondering actually what was going to happen to all the food that probably didn't get eaten at lunchtime, and that actually relates to this topic area. A couple of years ago I was judging some sustainability awards, environmental awards, and there was an entry in resource efficiency category. Lots of big companies were entering this, and this company was a food retailer. It wasn't one of the big four, but it was a big food retailer. And their sole application was based on the fact that food that was sellable, that they hadn't sold, they came up with a great idea of diverting it from landfill and giving it to fair share. Okay. And I thought, well, I wonder what would have happened if their procurement department had handed over the money for all of their supplies. And the suppliers just said, well, actually, I know you're not going to use all of this, so I'm only going to give you 90% of what you bought, but I'm going to take 100% of the money. Fine, no difference economically, financially, for you as a business. And so the question that I was posed was, well, is this idea of zero waste to landfill really driving the right behaviours? I was reminded of it in Peter's presentation yesterday morning, Peter from Natural Step International, because he mentioned Pret, who did exactly the same thing. All the stuff that they didn't sell, they said, we want to divert this from landfill, we're going to go and give it away. And it reminds me, I think, of what you said yesterday, which is, what's the value of waste, or what's the cost and what's the value of what we are not selling? What is it that's not going into product? And when you start to look at the stats on resource efficiency, government, £23 billion of savings, according to DEFRA, research from Oak Dean Hoynes, from low-cost, no-cost resource efficiency. Okay? But that actually doesn't include the lost value, i.e. materials that you've bought and processed that don't appear in your final product. So I think there's an idea there that actually a little bit more research, and maybe, I think it was Oliver yesterday, it'd be quite interesting in your Sankey flow diagrams in terms of putting costs of resources, cost of environmental inputs, environmental outputs, and actually looking at the financial lost value in production processes. A little bit about us as an organisation. So Steve mentioned we're a membership body of about 15,000 environment and sustainability professionals. They work in, well, I think it's about 83 countries. Some of them are expats, but the majority of those overseas are not. So that's quite interesting. We're big on developing skills, and for us, it's about how do we develop the capability in organisations to make transformational change, because that's what we're going to need. And we have to be able to do it at scale. We are a small organisation, and so it's how we partner with other people to have a bigger impact. So some of the work that we're just launching on new qualifications, we've gone with, for the low-level stuff, i.e. how do we mainstream some of this into business through non-environment people? Well, City and Guilds, they have 2.5 million learners a year, okay, going through their processes. So if we can embed some of our thinking into non-environmental people's thinking and development, then actually we can start to upskill economies. And then we do a lot of policy engagement. And for us, that's two-pronged. One is it's about harnessing the views and experience of people who are doing it for real to inform policy decision making. And it's also then to take those policies and say, okay, well, how best can we make these work in practice when, I nearly said the idiots in Westminster, when those in Westminster start developing laws and regulations and changing them and adding to them. Okay. A little bit about our interest in an activity on resources. We prefer to use the word to talk about resources. We don't really like to talk about waste. The government in 2010 launched its Waste Policies Review. We strongly advise them that they should be developing a UK national resources policy. That actually talking about waste is just the wrong language to get us onto the right agenda. Okay? And some of the things that we were calling for are in those bullet points there. We're active in developing the UK's Resource Security Action Plan, and that's something, the whole issue about security of supply, security of resources is not something that I've heard actually in the last couple of days, but I think if we're talking about the long-term sustainability of manufacturing, then actually we have to be looking at the materials and the ability of organisations to access those materials and have security of supply. And we've got some stuff on skills in there actually. Within our work on this whole area, we called for government to actually start to develop a dashboard of resources that are under threat, to bring that to life so that businesses can start to understand not only what their dependencies are, but where those might change over time, such that business can actually take action. Now, that action might be to look at it and think, well, we don't need to do anything this week, this month, this year. But the more enlightened ones will, and in some cases they are. And so, having called for that, that's been developed by the Environmental Sustainability Knowledge Transfer Network and is starting to be rolled out. So it's good that we have some impacts. And following the publication of the Resource Security Action Plan, then we've been working with people like the Engineering Employers Federation, a whole number of other trade bodies, to actually get a better handle on materials that are under threat to the UK economy. And the final one is that we do a lot of work on standards. We're involved in rewriting the Global International Standard 14001 on environmental management systems. I'm involved in Europe in work on the development of, or the integration of environmental thinking into broad-based standards. Okay, so if you take product standards, actually how can we integrate environmental thinking into typical product standards? So product standard for motorbike helmet, that industry develops. Well, actually, can we start to design out and standardize some key metrics around issues around, for example, resource efficiency? And that brings me to another point that Ian raised yesterday, which was about impact. What's the impact that you can have from the actions? So for IEMA, we talk about skills, and our ambition is to start to upskill whole economies. We want to transform the way people think about environment and sustainability. Our work on ISO 14001, we're a small organisation, we only employ 30 people. But here we have an opportunity to leverage the views of our members, 15,000, put into a standard. That standard's used by, I think at the last count by ISO, over 267,000 organisations are certified to that standard. So that if we can build in better frameworks for organisations dealing with environment and sustainability, well, we can have a bigger impact. And yeah, we've been successful in changing the law. So IEMA's evidence to government on greenhouse gas emissions management, if you look at the regulatory impact assessments that underpin the decision-making process in policy these days, so all the cost-benefit analysis that goes into that, then you will see that IEMA's work is cited throughout in helping to articulate the case about why that particular policy should come about. Okay, and that's just in terms of your research, if you want to have impact in policy, it's great to have Steve writing his narrative, 28th of October. We look forward to it. No, don't shut your eyes and roll your eyes and tonight, mañana. But it is actually the cost-benefit analysis which is more and more underpinning policy decisions. The Regulatory Policy Committee, the one in, one out, or one in, two out process of new regulation, the costs of business, so-called. Okay, so all of these things, you've got to look at these levers if you want to make policy change. Okay, I'll talk a bit, well, I just mentioned in passing consumption. And we talk about the, a number of people have talked over the last couple of days about the growing middle class. This is a Reuters piece, comes from the UN projections of population. Population to 2050 is up to 9.5 billion people. Interestingly, a couple of years ago, I was on a workshop tour of the UK. We were going to about 17 places talking about sustainable business practice. And we were talking about population. And during the course of that roadshow, the UN revised its population central growth projections. Now, their projection was that actually population was going to grow to 9.5 billion by 2050, but then it was going to decline towards the end of the century. But then they changed and updated their stats, and suddenly we've got another billion people expected to be on this planet in 2100 compared to their projection 5 years ago. Okay, that's a lot. That's 10% more. And then when you overlay that with the growth in the middle class, which you can see in the top half of that slide, it just brings home that transformation in terms of what is happening out in the world. And I think for us, one of the key things that key messages that we're bringing out is that this is not just about minimizing the impacts of business on the environment, but it's actually how is business going to operate in this future environment where resources are scarce, where the climate is changing, where weather patterns are increasingly disruptive. Okay. Some work and some of the work that I'll refer to in my subsequent slides. In 2011, we did some work on sustainable business practice. We did have a go at defining it, or coming up with something that we understood it to be. You've opened your eyes there, I can see it. We talked about creating social value without environmental harm as a way of businesses thinking about environment, which I think probably touches on your issue about care. Okay? So this is about what is your organisation doing in terms of creating social value, what's its purpose, and what's the benefit to society from doing it? And can you deliver that without harming the environment? By the way, you'll have to make a profit, but that's the very last thing. When we polled our members on that, we gave them a range of definitions around what sustainable business practice might mean. That was the one that most people tuned into, or it was the highest in terms of people responding. So, and then we've done some work this year on resources management. Typically, we do online polls of our members. These are just, checking the temperature, getting people to think about issues. We do workshops beforehand to sort of seed some of the questions. So this is not stratified research, but it will give you an idea of how people are thinking and what they're doing. Okay. Might be a bit of a complex slide, but we asked people what did they think were the primary opportunities for creating value from embedding sustainability in their organisation. And the thing that I wanted to highlight here was that better utilisation of resources was the key driver for most people. So the highest response rate was for better utilisation of resources. I'd like you to think about that as I go through what people are actually saying is happening in my subsequent slides, particularly when it comes down to issues about zero waste to landfill, diverting waste from landfill, whether it's actually driving the right behaviours. Okay. We asked people this year, in terms of the waste hierarchy, what are people doing? Because our concern is that by diverting waste from landfill, organisations are simply doing the next worst thing. And the next worst thing ain't good enough. Okay. So, bottom up, well, 30% respondents that said, actually, that's what we are seeing in our organisations as being our approach to dealing with waste. Top down, primarily, just over 20%. and about 45%, 43% multiple approaches, so they're taking a holistic approach. But that 30% is a concern, because those are organisations that aren't extracting maximum value from the resources that they're dealing with, and they ain't thinking about it. The reason that I pick out zero waste to landfill as well just is one of those things that is, I don't know, the unexpected consequences of policy, okay? Because zero waste to landfill was never a policy designed for business. It was actually a policy designed for local authorities. And it came from Europe, and it basically is mandated by directives. So DEFRA government has had this big thing about how can we divert waste from landfill, how can we get zero waste to landfill. It's been a mantra to try and get people. Actually, it's been adopted by business, and business has taken this up and driven it into their organisations. Actually, we were a bit surprised about the extent to which we are seeing companies operating a zero waste to landfill policy, because here you have those who have a public commitment. So these are ones that we're aware of. Very large companies, about 30% of respondents, their organisation had a zero waste to landfill public commitment. Even in SMEs, now, okay, these are people who've got environment people working in them, so yeah, you would expect them to be switched up. So this is not a reflection of the economy as a whole, but this differential is quite interesting. But here, actually, internally, it is a driving operating principle in organisations for well over 70 to 80% of respondents. Okay. But then when you say, well, actually, what is it doing? Waste prevention, only 28%. Improving reuse, okay. Increasing recycling. Invariably, what we've seen is companies changing their waste contracts. And all that valuable resource gets into the hand of the big waste management companies, the Shanks, the Biffers. They're loving it, I suspect, because they're getting all of this resource, and you guys are paying for it to be taken away. Wow. The resource circular economy, that's a business model, isn't it? I think it's only ISO that has a different business model where I do all the work and don't get paid, and they sell the standards for an absolute fortune and get all the money. But that is a real business model. That is a concern, to have all of that material flowing into a relatively small number of organisations, and not being clear, we don't know where that waste is, so we don't know where these materials are, we don't know what that material is, we don't know how it's flowing through the economy. We need to open this up. So what did we find when we spoke to companies about their experience? Well, some of them said, yeah, the first thing we did was we thought about changing our contracts and getting our waste provider to deal with it, and we'll put a condition on them, zero waste to landfill, and so they're going to have to do all the legwork. But then we did actually see that a lot of companies said that actually no, that might have been our first easy win, can we tick a box that says we're doing this? But actually that's not going to drive change. And what we have seen is a lot more companies taking this as a way of stimulating better use of resources in their organisation. So it's not all bad. It doesn't, though, and it isn't driving a focus at the top of the waste hierarchy. So it isn't driving people to drive out waste. And I think when you start to look at the tools that people are using, they're not using material flow analysis, they're not using material cost flow analysis to really understand where resources are being used in their organisation and how best they can deal with them. And they're certainly not looking at and trying to calculate lost value from the resources that they have in their organisation. There are a number of organisations that use, derive co-products, put stuff together, they sell stuff. But if that's not their primary purpose, then it still could be classed as lost value from primary production. It's just less bad. Okay, so it's a mitigating factor. And I think depending on the nature of your organisation, zero waste to landfill can take you to a certain level, but it's not the whole story. Now, one of the things that we did in our work in 2011 was try to get a better handle of how organisations are taking a more strategic and a holistic view about their organisation. Okay, so the extent to which they were looking not just at operational footprints. Sorry, Steve, I'm keeping you awake, aren't I?
I'm writing.
Nearly. Fantastic. Okay. So we were saying, okay, well, how well are you managing these issues? Have you got programs in place to deal with resources, with waste, not just operationally, but are you building this into your thinking in the design of products and services? Are you building this into the way in which you deal with suppliers? Okay. Yeah, lots of people are doing some stuff on waste. Obviously, what we can see is a lot more happening operationally than in product development and supply. Interesting that it's in the products and service delivery that people have probably more control, and therefore they're able to think about these issues more readily. And supply chains are, so the bits in red, have the lowest input. Okay, and this looks, this looks pretty depressing, particularly when you look down here. Resources and materials. Goodness me, that is, a low level of people thinking about this, about the way in which they manage these issues, not just in their operations, but in their supply chains and what it means in terms of their products and services. Picture gets a little bit better when they say, well, okay, well, you might not have something absolutely comprehensive and fully embedded plan and program that is delivering, but actually you might have stuff that's underway. Okay, well, then it gets a lot better. But still, climate change adaptation, ecosystems and biodiversity, people are really struggling with that. Again, stuff, less than 70% of respondents said that they had, stuff on resources management active as a conscious like program in their organisation, or that they had something that was, something that was happening. Bizarre. Okay. Another thing there, this jumps back to our waste survey this year. Looking now at information flow. What we see is that organisations are very good at telling other people what to do down your supply chain. Give me this information. I want data on carbon. I want data on resources. I want data on your waste. But actually, they're not bringing that information back up. So we're not having a good understanding of how resources are flowing and resource management is flowing across supply chains. Information flow is one way, and it's top down. But actually, your suppliers have probably got some really good ideas about how you can use materials better if you only gave them a chance. But that requires partnership working, engagement. I can't remember how many suppliers Mike said that they had in M&S yesterday, but it was a hell of a number. So actually having direct interaction with those on these issues is quite difficult. There's no doubt why Mike said, actually, we need fewer suppliers that we can have a stronger relationship with in the future. I didn't get a chance to ask the question. I wonder what that means for particularly the smaller end of the SME community. The majority of organisations in the UK are small and micro companies. But if businesses are wanting bigger relationships then, and they want shorter supply chains, I wonder what that happens for what everybody says is the engine of the economy. Anyway, that's just a passing thought. We also asked about how are organisations reporting on these things? So some people are producing annual consumption production figures, some people are comparing them to base years as well, some people are just giving a number, some people not applicable, okay? But what we see is that much more in terms of reporting is about waste, and a lot less is about resources and resource use. Okay, so we're just not getting it in organisations. And until we start to turn that corner, we're not going to deal with the challenges that we face in terms of not having enough resources to meet our current demand as well as what we might expect in the future. Some of the factors that prevent these happening, or that drive, sorry. So cost savings is the biggest issue for for organisations internally about getting stuff done. That is not a surprise, but what that does mean is that the models and tools that you guys are developing, they have to somehow feed into a coherent business case. So what we see when we're developing the skills and capabilities of environment sustainability professionals is that, yes, they have to be able to do rate of return on investment, and they have to net value, and all of these other financial metrics to put together their business cases, because otherwise they're not going to get anything done. Okay? And the external factors, legal requirements. Steve mentioned taxation yesterday, landfill tax. UK government has a policy commitment by George Osborne that over the lifetime of this Parliament, the proportion of UK revenue from environmental taxes will increase. Okay, so if you think you're paying a lot for your resources, your waste disposal, your water disposal, your greenhouse gas emissions, it's going to be taxed even more. Okay, so again, the financial dynamic for organisations is increasing. What is it that this actually starts to unlock? Well, what we see is that recovery from the value chain, 28% of organisations are now starting to recognise that they have to do something about this. And this for us is quite interesting because, again, it's going to require a lot more partnership work. Requires better information management, better working with your suppliers. Really interesting example, Rolls-Royce, okay, with their reverts program. Some of the materials that Rolls-Royce uses, I think they take more than 50% of the world's annual production, okay, for some of their materials. They are only in very small quantities, but they are a critical material for the aerospace sector, and they use a lot of it, of what is produced. And those are co-products, by the way. So typically, not only are they using small quantities, but actually a significant proportion of the world's supply, but also those are produced as a co-product from other primary production. That's an incredible issue for resource security, okay? What they do is that when they work with their suppliers, they say, all right, okay, well, you're going to help us to make this particular component. Here's the material. We'll give you the material. We want 100% of that material back, either in the product or, okay, so we own the materials that are in our supply chain. We will collect it, we'll put it back together again. We're going to keep absolute hold of it. So what's holding stuff back? Competing priorities. It's lack of perceived business benefit, even though we know that the biggest benefit was better utilisation of resources. That all of this has money-saving opportunities, lack of support. So there's a huge issue about getting this on people's agenda, making the case, changing behaviours in organisations, selling the story about why this matters. And that comes back to the language we use to speak to business rather than it's green, it's fluffy, wouldn't it be lovely too? This doesn't work. And I'll leave you with this slide. We asked people how far in the future they think about these issues when they're developing programs on these topic areas, okay? So climate change adaptation, 21% of respondents said they take a planning process beyond 10 years, okay? But when it comes down to waste and resources, it's actually 3 years if you're lucky, 1 year. This is businesses making the assumption that we'll have unlimited supply of materials like we have today at the same price, and that is today's business model, and that isn't going to last. So what we have to do is to change these around so that the majority of businesses are taking a much longer term view of how they deal with materials, with resources, and deal with this issue. Whether our economic model supports that, well, it might be a question for the panel. No, I'm on the panel. No, a question for you guys as researchers. Okay. So if we're going to make this transition, we have to do a lot more about resource efficiency, and that's what a lot of you have been focusing on in your programs. Resource security, security of supply, is going to be a much bigger issue as we go forward. And that will drive greater demand for resource efficiency, but also material substitution, etc. And then resource cycling is also a critical issue. Not just when they're out in the economy, but also within supply chains. We're seeing more and more organizations closing supply chain loops and actually having a more vertically integrated process of resources. And as you move towards service-based delivery, that actually supports that much more readily. Thank you very much.